right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are at 2:30, which means it is Air Force budget time. In just a moment, General John Pletcher and Ms. Carolyn Gleason are going to present the Air Force budget submission for this year's President's budget. When we get to our question and answer portion, I'll revisit this then, but again, I know most of you, but please do identify yourself by affiliation and name for our own records. With that, sir, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Hope. Well, good afternoon again. Thanks for sticking around for the Air Force FY20 PB rollout briefing. We want to certainly give you as much information as we can up front, and then we'll leave some time at the end for questions. Let me start out by giving you the bottom line up front. The Air Force's FY20 budget requests $165.6 billion to continue our path to build a more lethal and ready Air Force. That's a $9.8 billion increase over the FY19 appropriation, with the increase enabling growth in both readiness accounts as well as continuing steady increases in our military end strength, a renewed emphasis on infrastructure recovery, and our ongoing focus to develop and field faster and smarter the advanced capabilities needed for a return to great power competition. Along the way, we'll highlight some of the successes we've been able to achieve with recent congressional support, and we'll spend the majority of our time discussing the highlights within each appropriation. Finally, we'll touch on the Overseas Contingency Operations account before providing some closing thoughts and opening the floor to your questions. Next slide, please. Actors in today's international security environment aim to threaten U.S. prosperity and security around the globe. The National Defense Strategy prioritizes military capabilities that counter overt challenges to the free and open international order and the reemergence of long-term strategic competition between nations, in particular China and Russia. Through coercion and intimidation, these actors aim to threaten regional neighbors, undermine our allies, and displace American influence across the globe. These great power competitors look to challenge U.S. dominance across all warfighting domains and confront us through information warfare, ambiguous or denied proxy operations, and subversive actions. To face these challenges, we must compete, deter, and win across the 5 priority missions of the National Defense Strategy. Those 5 missions are: 1, defend the homeland; 2, provide a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent; 3, defeat a powerful conventional enemy; 4, deter opportunistic aggression; and 5, disrupt violent extremists in a cost-effective manner. Each of these missions requires a combination of capabilities from all military services, and the Air Force is integral to every one of them. In fact, the Air Force is unique in that we must be ready every day to accomplish all 5 of these missions simultaneously. With these priority missions in our windscreen, we developed the FY20 President's budget request to build a more lethal and ready force while focused on fielding tomorrow's Air Force faster and smarter. Currently, the Air Force has 312 operational squadrons, and those squadrons continue to be in very high demand, employing unrivaled air, space, and cyber power from over 179 locations across the globe. But to counter the threats projected in the 2025 to 2030 timeline, as defined in the future defense planning scenarios, we must increase our capacity to evolve to incorporate advanced technology and cutting-edge capabilities in new and innovative ways. While the FY20 budget does not directly fund additional squadrons to build toward the future Air Force we need, it does set the conditions for success by fielding faster and smarter the technology and innovation that will allow us to achieve a strategic advantage over near-peer competitors. On the next slide, we'll highlight how the FY20 budget improves readiness and increases lethality. Next slide, please. Our National Defense Strategy directs a more lethal and ready force prepared to defeat our adversaries in high-end combat. And through the following 7 priorities, this budget request accelerates warfighter lethality and continues to restore readiness to our squadrons. First and foremost, readiness recovery is about people. The FY20 President's budget request increases our total force military end strength by 4,400 airmen to a total of 511,000. To prepare our airmen to fight alongside allies and partners and defeat the high-end threat, this budget includes 1.3 million total peacetime contingency flying hours, the current maximum executable amount, and includes funds to modernize our live and virtual ranges and training infrastructures such as Nevada Test and Training Range and the Joint Pacific-Alaska Range Complex. Second, the FY20 budget restores the readiness of the force through cost-effective maintenance and logistics. We continue to prioritize our weapon system sustainment programs, growing this account by $1.7 billion in the FY20 request to ensure our aircraft's equipment and systems are ready when needed. This budget also funds enterprise sustaining engineering efforts to drive down sustainment costs through automation, streamlined supply chains, and industry-adapted condition-based maintenance practices such as analytic tools and monitoring sensors. Third, this request continues our unwavering focus on aviation safety. Ensuring we do not compromise safety as we prepare our airmen to fight today and tomorrow, the Air Force will always prioritize and repair any immediate issues that may endanger our air crews. As a specific example, this budget funds a next-generation ejection seat designed to mitigate ejection risks for aircrew wearing helmet-mounted devices in multiple fighter and bomber aircraft. Fourth, the FY20 request supports the Air Force's commitment to providing a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent. The NDS, the Nuclear Posture Review, and the National Defense Strategy Commission all reaffirm America's need for a modernized nuclear triad. The FY20 budget continues the upgrade and recapitalization of the ICBM and bomber legs of the nuclear triad, as well as modernization of the nuclear command, control, and communication capability. Fifth, we continue our modernization efforts across multiple weapons systems. The FY20 budget increases funding to continue the B-21 development program, which is poised to add significant capability to both our nuclear and conventional operations. We remain committed to the F-35 and its game-changing capabilities through the procurement of 48 F-35s. And this FY20 budget request also balances readiness and modernization in the near term by procuring 8 F-15EX aircraft to refresh our aging F-15C fleet, allowing us to benefit from foreign partner investments in the F-15 line. Sixth, we continue our focus on cyber dominance by funding our 39 offensive and defensive cyber mission force teams in support of the U.S. Cyber Command to simultaneously generate effects in cyberspace while we secure and defend our systems against attack. Furthermore, our Joint Cyber Command and Control System provides combatant commanders with cyber situational awareness and battle management of our forces. Finally, we continue our efforts to accelerate toward defendable space. With a fourth consecutive year of growth, our space portfolio is growing 17% over FY19, building on previous advances and further accelerating the competitive advantages relied upon by our warfighters. The FY20 request develops resilient satellite communications and procures the first GPS-3 follow-on satellite, keys to thwarting attempts to blind or jam our space systems. And as you've heard, this budget includes the initial funding to stand up the provisional elements of the United States Space Force headquarters under the Department of the Air Force. Although establishing a Space Force will require enabling legislation from Congress, this provisional headquarters will be responsible for addressing scope of mission and functions, organizational components, and planning considerations to implement the new service. Now let's shift our attention from what we buy to how we're buying it as we capitalize on new acquisition authorities and streamline and agile processes to deliver required capabilities to the field faster and smarter. Next slide, please. Let's face it, the acquisition system we inherited from the Cold War era is too slow for the digital age. China is innovating faster than we are and fielding game-changing capabilities that threaten the advantages we enjoy. To accelerate fielding of new U.S. capabilities, the 2016 and 2017 National Defense Authorization Acts delegated acquisition responsibility down to the services and granted new acquisition authorities as well. We're utilizing these new authorities to deliver to the warfighter faster and smarter the capabilities called for in the National Defense Strategy. Let me highlight 4 specific ways in which we're doing this. First, we're capitalizing on the prototyping and experimentation authority Congress provided. Using this authority, the FY20 budget continues the funding to accelerate hypersonics development, keeping us on a path to build and fly our nation's first hypersonic boost glide weapon 5 years earlier than anticipated. Additionally, we'll continue our experimentation efforts for the light attack aircraft by including funds in the FY20 budget to build on what we've learned in the first 2 experiments and expand the experiment to other classes of air vehicles, such as unmanned, rotary, or turbojet aircraft. Through this experimentation, we can ensure the U.S. and our international partners have the right mix of options with the necessary intelligence and information sharing capabilities to fulfill the counter-VEO mission. Second, we're empowering our acquisition professionals to tailor the acquisition process, structuring their decisions to best support the needs of the program. As an example, our B-52 commercial engine replacement program utilizes digital modeling to conduct digital fly-offs, finding design flaws earlier in the development period and fixing them before building. This modeling will save 3 years from the normal development timelines, as well as improve fuel efficiency. Third, we're transitioning away from our historically slow and unresponsive approach to software in favor of a much more agile and rapid development approach. A key to this change is putting acquirers and operators together to focus on rapid incremental software improvements that deliver at the speed of relevance. Leading this change is our Kessler Run Experimentation Laboratory. One example of Kessler Run's agile development successes is a new software tool they developed for air refueling planning that helped the Air Force reduce fuel consumption by millions of dollars each month and reduce the requirement by 2 tankers in support of the counter-ISIS campaign. That software tool was delivered in months instead of years. And finally, our commitment to competition continues to reap positive results. Recent contract awards for National Security Space Launch, the Global Positioning Satellite 3F, and UH-1 helicopter replacement and the TX trainer netted over $15 billion in savings over the program estimates. In addition, our focus on expanded competition has opened the door to more innovators. By reducing bureaucracy and removing barriers to entry, our Space and Missile Systems Center is awarding prototype contracts twice as fast as traditional contracting methods, opening the door to more companies. We're also seeking small business and entrepreneurs' ideas with our inaugural Pitch Day, as well as airmen's inputs through our Spark Tank competition. These programs provide an entry to non-traditional vendors, foster innovation, and find revolutionary ideas to the Air Force's toughest problems. As you know, we can only achieve these goals of building a more lethal and ready Air Force while fielding these new capabilities faster and smarter through the continued support of our Congress. On the next slide, I'll cover the fiscal environment, highlighting the recent successes and the need to maintain that funding commitment in the coming years. Next slide, please. In the past few years, through support from Congress, the Air Force has accelerated modernization programs while simultaneously building a more lethal and ready force. Since FY17, Congress has appropriated Air Force funding roughly $50 billion above the Budget Control Act caps. Listed below are 4 areas where these additional funds enabled key improvements. First, we grew over 14,000 total force military personnel. These airmen filled critical gaps in aircrew, maintenance, remotely piloted aircraft, intelligence, and cyber career fields that set the foundation for our readiness recovery. Second, almost $1 billion in full spectrum readiness funds addressed gaps in supplies and equipment across the Air Force, and specifically in the Indo-Pacific area of operations. This included chemical defense ensembles, cold weather gear, communications equipment, and medical war reserve material to ready our forces to fight tonight. Third, our research and development budget almost doubled. These funds honed our technical edge against rapidly modernizing competitors and accelerated game-changing technologies and space programs that will make a difference in the warfight of today and tomorrow. Finally, we procured an additional 23 F-35A Joint Strike Fighters. This accelerated production of the equivalent of an entire F-35A squadron 1 year earlier to ensure the Air Force remains lethal against emerging high-end threats. In addition to top-line increases, we are appreciative of Congress passing the FY19 National Defense Authorization Act and defense appropriation bills on time. As a result, we've been able to accelerate spending on our operations and maintenance account by $3.7 billion this year, compared to this time last year. This timely funding was key to advancing our readiness recovery and specifically addressing mission-capable rates for our fighter platforms. We're grateful for the continued congressional support and the subsequent confidence it injects in our military and industry partners. The FY20 President's budget builds on these gains. However, we're not relying solely on additional funding to accelerate our NDS implementation. We're driving smarter use of resources through reform efforts and creating our own trade space. As one example, we improved the modeling of our military personnel costs by analyzing how personnel entitlements expend over time. And this analysis led to targeted improvements in budgeting for basic pay, permanent change of station, and other accounts, enabling the Air Force to realign $1.6 billion over the next 5 years to address other readiness and lethality needs. Additionally, through the identification of redundant capabilities, we were able to divest all funding for the Eagle Vision program through an agreement between the Air Force and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Now the Air Force receives a higher resolution of service at no cost to the Air Force, saving $21 million per year. Finally, looking to maximize the return on every dollar we spend, we've implemented a new infrastructure investment strategy. This strategy shifts Air Force infrastructure spending from a worst first approach to a prioritization based on mission needs and getting the most bang for the buck. Utilizing three primary lines of effort: first, restoring readiness to power projection platforms; second, cost-effective modernization of infrastructure; and third, driving innovation to installation management, we can accelerate infrastructure readiness, resilience, and modernization. However, even with increased buying power through reform initiatives, the true ability to continue our multi-year effort of rebuilding readiness and lethality while modernizing our force requires predictable, requirement-driven funding. The most critical element of support we need from Congress is to find a way forward on the budget front to continue delivering the top line necessary to implement the National Defense Strategy and protect America's vital national interests. With these budget priorities, streamlined acquisition processes, and strategic and fiscal environments in mind, let's begin to break down the FY20 budget. Next slide, please. The stacked columns on this slide illustrate the breakout by appropriation of the fiscal year 19 enacted appropriation and the fiscal year 20 budget request. These columns represent the total force budget request to include active guard and reserve. Starting on the right, when you exclude the $39.2 billion non-blue pass-through, the Air Force budget for FY20, including both base and overseas contingency operations, is $165.6 billion, a $9.8 billion or 6.3% increase over FY19's enacted budget authority. You'll also notice there's a significant change in our operations and maintenance, or O&M, and the overseas contingency operations accounts. This change is due to a shift of significant portion of the Air Force O&M funding from the base budget to the OCO budget. And as you've heard before, this is a department-wide decision to comply with the Budget Control Act by holding the base budget request under the BCA caps. We'll discuss the details of the overall OCO budget later in the briefing. To compare the FY20 budget request to the FY19 appropriation, let me shift your attention to the two stacked bars on the left. Here you'll see an apples-to-apples comparison of FY19's enacted appropriation to the FY20 budget request, where we've applied an OCO rule set similar to that used in FY19. As you can see, the requirements driving the majority of the overall $9.8 billion budget increase in FY20 are in O&M, military personnel, and research, development, testing, and evaluation, or the RDT&E appropriations. We'll discuss the drivers of the changes in more detail in the coming slides. First, let's start with a look at the O&M account. Next slide, please. Our operations and maintenance, or O&M appropriations, are our largest account, making up 36% of our FY20 request. This account finances our day-to-day operations and is critical to our continued efforts to restore readiness. And as you can see, our FY20 O&M request includes a $4.7 billion increase over the FY19 appropriation. In part, this is due to $1.3 billion in growth for our facility sustainment, restoration, and modernization program, which was a 48% increase over FY19. After years of falling short of our infrastructure investment goals, we've significantly increased our infrastructure budget both here and in our military construction appropriation, which I'll discuss later. Since we fight from our bases, these increases begin to turn the corner on ensuring our power projection platforms are ready for tomorrow's fight. Another significant driver of the O&M growth is a $1.4 billion increase, which includes both base and OCO, to our FY20 Weapons System Sustainment, or WSS, portfolio. This $1.4 billion total increase is a combination of the $1.7 billion base budget increase to WSS that you see on this slide, offset by a $300 million reduction in OCO funding for WSS. With this funding, we continue the prioritization of our 204 pacing units to ensure our lead force packages are ready to fight tonight, while also advancing the overall readiness of the force to achieve our FY20 and FY22 readiness goals. Additionally, this budget resources over $6 billion for 1.1 million peacetime flying hours, again funding this readiness program to current maximum executable levels. These baseline hours, combined with the live and virtual training range improvements and increased adversary air sorties, retain and sharpen today's aviators and help us increase pilot production to 1,480 pilots in FY20. This request also right-sizes our installation support accounts, adding almost $1 billion compared to the FY19 appropriation. This change minimizes reprogramming actions in the year of execution and ensures our must-pay installation maintenance contracts and utilities are funded to the levels we've historically executed. Finally, this request includes $3.3 billion for our cyber mission set and $2.5 billion for our space operations and training requirements. And as I mentioned earlier, this budget resources the stand-up of the initial U.S. Space Force headquarters with $72 million to cover the initial personnel and operating costs. Through this O&M budget request and other initiatives, our airmen will be organized, trained, and equipped to meet the complex challenges we face across the multi-domain battle space. Next, let's turn our attention to the military personnel appropriation. Next slide, please. In fiscal year 20, we continue the steady growth of our military end strength and add funding for a 3.1% military pay raise, a 3.4% increase to basic allowance for housing, and a 2.4% increase to basic allowance for subsistence. As I mentioned earlier, this budget also reflects the savings from a reform effort to improve the modeling of military personnel costs, an effort that reduced our FY20 military personnel budget request by $490 million. In terms of end strength, this budget request supports our 5th consecutive year of increases, with FY20 growing an additional 4,400 airmen over FY19 levels to just under 511,000 total force military members. This brings us back to our FY12 pre-sequester manning levels. In terms of mission sets, this budget targets critical skill gaps across active Guard and Reserve components, such as special warfare airmen, intel, cyber, and nuclear defenders. We also continue to enhance the capability of our recently added maintainers, ensuring their skills and abilities are prepared for both fleet modernization and readiness goals. Additionally, the FY20 military personnel budget expands efforts to address the pilot shortfall and retention challenges in other career fields through a $30 million increase for targeted bonuses, which when coupled with non-monetary efforts, which are mostly funded within our O&M appropriation, aim to retain seasoned airmen in stressed career fields and airmen performing hazardous duties, ensuring critical Air Force specialties are preserved. Through these efforts, the Air Force will be better sized, better trained, and more lethal to face the challenges of great power competition. Next, let's shift our attention to the Air Force Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation budget request, where Ms. Gleason will discuss how a third straight year of substantial growth enables our ability to develop the capabilities that will be necessary to counter the threats of tomorrow. Next slide, please.
Thank you, General Pletcher. As General Pletcher mentioned earlier, our RDT&E appropriation has almost doubled in the last 4 years, and the FY20 budget request is an increase of $4.5 billion over what was appropriated in FY19. This year's budget invests heavily in innovative technologies and focuses on modernization of key capabilities shaped by the National Defense Strategy. We continue to modernize our aircraft fleets, recapitalize 2/3 of the nuclear triad, accelerate defendable space capabilities, and invest in technologies to maintain our edge against emerging threats. This budget increases development funding for the B-21 by $725 million as the program transitions from design to manufacturing development. It also continues TX development to recapitalize our aging T-38 fleet, invests $794 million in F-35 Block 4 capabilities, a $290 million increase from the FY19 enacted amount, funds $247 million to advance capabilities for the Combat Rescue Helicopter, continues the presidential aircraft recapitalization, and invests in multiple legacy aircraft. Additionally, the FY20 request adds $1.8 billion in procurement and RDT&E funding to accelerate our defendable space investments, securing the satellite constellations that power our military forces and civil societies. We continue efforts to accelerate development of the next generation overhead persistent infrared sensor to enhance our missile warning, and invest $463 million in the GPS-3 follow-on constellation to provide enhanced anti-jam position, navigation, and timing. Moreover, this budget invests $713 million in the long-range standoff weapon to replace the air-launched cruise missile, and $570 million in the ground-based strategic deterrent designed to recapitalize the aging Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile. These two efforts will ensure the reliability and effectiveness of the most responsive and flexible legs of the nuclear triad. Furthermore, the FY20 request invests in advancing technologies to counter emerging threats, including the Next Generation Air Dominance, or NGAD, family of systems. Although most of the specifics of NGAD are classified, this budget increases funding by $570 million to resource the most promising technologies needed to close air superiority gaps as identified in the Air Superiority 2030 Flight Plan. Finally, our budget continues efforts to institutionalize prototyping and experimentation to quickly move game-changing technologies into warfighting capability. Specifically, we invest $878 million to continue the Adaptive Engine Transition Program, which is providing revolutionary advances in fighter turbine engine performance. In addition, we invest $576 million in hypersonics efforts to include both the air-launched rapid response weapon and the hypersonic conventional strike weapon, with each scheduled to achieve initial operational capability by FY22. This budget also focuses our directed energy efforts on prototypes for the base defense mission. These increased RDT and investments build on progress made in FY18 and FY19, safeguard our technological edge against near-peer competitors, and enable the Air Force to accelerate the next generation capabilities required to counter threats outlined in the National Defense Strategy. Now let's take a look at the highlights of our FY20 procurement appropriations. Next slide, please. Our procurement appropriations remain relatively stable as we continue buying aircraft, space assets, launch services, and munitions at a steady pace. In future years, some of these accounts will increase as RDT&E investments we just reviewed move into production. Looking specifically at our aircraft procurement account, our FY20 request funds $5.7 billion to procure 48 F-35A aircraft, continuing our commitment to the F-35 and its game-changing capabilities. This budget also adds $1.1 billion to purchase 8 F-15EXs to begin to replace aging F-15Cs. In addition, the baseline aircraft procurement account continues recapitalizations for tankers, providing $2.2 billion to procure 12 KC-46As, and rotary assets funding $884 million for 12 combat rescue helicopters, as well as 8 MC-130s. Our baseline budget also funds 3 additional MQ-9s, in addition to the 9 aircraft funded via the Overseas Contingency Operations account, for a total of 12 procured in FY20. Our FY20 space procurement request funds 4 national security space launches, leveraging a public-private partnership to inject competition into the market. In addition, $415 million in this budget procures the first GPS-3 follow-on satellite, adding to the robust GPS constellation. For the munitions account, the table on the bottom right of the slide includes both base and OCO funding to allow for an easier comparison between fiscal years. The FY20 President's Budget request begins to transition our munitions priorities from the counter-VEO fight to the high-end fight. During this shift, we continue to maximize production of the Joint Direct Attack Munition, Small Diameter Bomb, and Hellfire, while placing greater emphasis on the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile Extended Range, or JASSM-ER, and the Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile, or AMRAAM, both of which are critical to defeating threats in a highly contested environment. Having highlighted the changes in our procurement funding lines, let's take a quick look at our major procurement quantities in the FY20 budget. Next slide. Shown on this slide are procurement quantities for both the base and OCO accounts that were included in the FY18 and FY19 appropriations, as well as the total quantities funded in the FY20 President's Budget request. Let me pause here for a moment to allow you to review the numbers on the slide. And now let me turn it back over to General Pletcher to highlight the investments and changes in our military construction, BRAC, and family housing appropriations.
Thank you, Ms. Gleason. This is another good news story for the Air Force, as our FY20 request includes the first meaningful increase to our military construction budget in over 4 years, with a 24% increase compared to FY19. Notably, a significant portion of this request, $1.1 billion, is for existing mission construction projects. This increase, combined with the additional restoration and modernization funds in our O&M account, begins to address the deferred infrastructure maintenance risk that has been building since sequestration. As you can see from this slide, this request includes funding for infrastructure improvements across the range of Air Force missions and includes funding for active Guard and Reserve bases. Additionally, this request supports $530 million from Combatant Command MILCON requirements, particularly in the Indo-Pacific area, and funds the limited bed-down requirements required for new missions. Moreover, the FY20 budget request continues reconstruction efforts at Tyndall Air Force Base, which was devastated by Hurricane Michael last October. In addition to $466 million of facility sustainment, restoration, and modernization funds in our O&M account, the DoD, as you heard earlier, set aside emergency funding in this budget request that may be used to help rebuild Tyndall once the planning and design work is completed. Finally, switching to our military family housing appropriations, the health and safety of our airmen and their families is a top priority, so much so that we recently conducted a 100% boots-on-the-ground review of housing across the service to identify, document, and fix any health or safety risks. While much is being done in the near term and quickly to address any problems, we must ensure our corrective actions are consistently applied and enduring. This budget request supports our military family housing needs through continuous oversight of privatized housing, sustainment of government-owned inventory, and leasing of homes as required. That was our final base budget account, so now let's take a look at the Overseas Contingency Operation, or OCO portion of the FY20 request. Next slide, please. Another change, as you've heard earlier today, is the FY20 President's Budget Request classification of our OCO accounts. In this FY20 request, we've included 3 categories of funding. The first category is OCO for direct war costs, which includes combat or direct combat support costs that will not continue once combat operations end. The second category is OCO for enduring requirements, which includes requirements previously funded in OCO for in-theater and in-CONUS activities that will likely continue after combat operations cease. And the final category is OCO for base requirements, which includes funding for traditional base budget expenses that are financed in our FY20 OCO request in order for the Department to comply with the Budget Control Act of 2011. Focusing on the first 2 categories of OCO, this budget prioritizes operations and retrograde missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and expands European infrastructure through the European Deterrence Initiative and continues counterterrorism operations. Our FY20 direct war and enduring OCO accounts show a $2 billion decrease from FY19, primarily due to fewer MQ-9 purchases in FY20 and less munitions funded in this category. These accounts continue supporting personnel at 6 enduring locations, fund remotely piloted aircraft combat lines, replenish consumed munitions, build 7 European Deterrence Initiative construction projects, and procure 9 MQ-9 aircraft. Switching to the OCO for base requirements, the $29.6 billion funds traditional base budget requirements such as flying hours, weapon system sustainment, and base operating support. We've also included funding for additional munitions in this OCO for base category. All of these requirements were included and briefed in the previous slides to provide you with an apples-to-apples programmatic comparison, even though the funding for these requirements will be requested in the OCO portion of the budget. Let me close with a few final thoughts before we open it up for your questions. Next slide, please. The Air Force is called upon to compete, deter, and win across the 5 priority missions of the National Defense Strategy. This FY20 President's Budget Request is driven by this strategy and focused on building more lethal and ready force and prepared to defeat our adversaries in the high-end fight. This budget request takes needed steps to restore our readiness and increase lethality while simultaneously fielding the force faster and smarter. However, we can't fully implement the National Defense Strategy to protect America's vital national interests without sufficient budget top line. Preserving lethality and readiness gains requires continued congressional funding support in the form of predictable, timely, and requirement-driven funding. As I said earlier, this is the most critical element in enabling the Air Force to field the capabilities and build the capacity needed for the next 2 decades. As we have in the past, we must come together to find a way forward. Thank you very much. Welcome your questions.
Sandra.
Thank you. Sandra Irwin, Space News. General, can you explain the 17% space growth? What is the 19 enacted number that increased by 17%?
Well, as Ms. Gleason pulls up the details, the 17% increases across all appropriations, RDT&E, procurement, O&M, and MilPERS. So it looks at the entire portfolio. And so we'd have to give you those individuals, but I think we've got the number here. Let me have her pulled up. And it essentially is a continued emphasis that we've had on accelerating to defendable space, growing capabilities. Some of that is just what new satellites we're funding in this program as well. But do you have the numbers, Carolyn?
Right, so in 19, across that portfolio, we were enacted just over 11.8 billion. And in 20, we're enacted 13.8. So it's roughly a 17%. Most of our growth is in R&D and a little bit in procurement, but it's predominantly research and development.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks. Mike Stone from Reuters. First question, the KC-46 purchase is slowing. Can you explain why? And then second, the directed energy amount from last year and this year, can you break that out for us, please?
The KC-46, essentially we're committed to 15 a year. 2 years ago, we got 3 additional added by Congress. So this 12 that we buy in FY20 still keeps us at 15 a year on average over those 3 years. And do you have the directed energy number?
I don't. We're going to have to take that. I don't have a number for that broken out. Sorry.
Hi, Valerie Instina, Defense News. Can you talk a little bit about the light attack experiment and where that's going, how much is being spent this year, where that money is coming from, and how those experiments might be different?
Yes. So in the FY20 budget, we have $35 million for the light attack experiment. It essentially continues the experiment from the past 2 years. The decision the Air Force had to make this year was essentially, are we ready to go to a program of record, given what we had learned up to this point with the first two experiments? And keeping in mind, the light attack is all about allies and partners. That's the most important thing. The second line of effort from the Secretary of Defense and the NDS is to attract more partners and to support our allies. And the light attack aircraft is all about providing the right mix of capability in a weapon system that would be most attractive to those allies and partners to take on the counter-VEO mission. The results of the experiment from the first 2 phases, we just didn't feel comfortable that we had the right mix of capabilities that was going to attract the partners and allies that we needed. So we want to look further, as I said in the briefing, potentially look at rotary and fixed wing, potentially look at manned and unmanned, potentially look at turboprop and turbojet, and do a study across the industry as well, looking at what are the most likely interests for allies and partners across the globe. The $35 million in 20 allows us to continue that experiment, and we'll continue that. And eventually, in the out years, without getting into too much detail, there's procurement dollars in the out years that will allow us to start a program should the results of the experiment say it's a good investment to do so.
Go to Laura.
Hi, Lara Sellinger with Foreign Policy. Thanks for doing this. I wanted to clarify, there's been some conversation today about INF treaty non-compliant weapons, and we know the Army's working on something. I'm wondering if there's anything in the Air Force's books that would potentially support that, such as a restart of the ground-launched cruise missile program.
No, I appreciate that. I actually heard your question earlier. I'll put it this way: there's nothing I'm aware of in terms of development of a non-INF treaty missile. But to be accurate, let me make sure we take that question for the record and get back to you.
Questions on the F-15X.
Sure.
That's going to get a lot of attention. 1.1 billion divided by 8. I mean, is it going to be that expensive going forward?
Part of that is non-recurring engineering in the first year. So there's, as you know, when you buy a new weapon system, you've got to pay for the aircraft, but you also got to set up the line. Although at the same time, we're leveraging much of the investment of the allies that have been buying the F-15. But there is some non-recurring engineering in the first year, and then of course you got the spares and everything else as well. So I won't get into the specific numbers that are going to be part of a contract negotiation, but I think you see 1.1 billion. I wouldn't say that's the same average cost we would expect to see every year after that.
The $80 million range is Boeing's claimed, roughly, after going forward?
I think if you looked only at aircraft, that might be a reasonable number, but you're going to have all the other items that come with buying aircraft, such as spares and such. So that's just the airframe itself. And again, the contract negotiation will kind of make the final determination.
80 in the fit-up?
It's not 80 in the fit-up. It's more than that. I don't even know what the out.
You mean
Oh.
number of aircraft?
Oh,
Yes,
yes,
it's
I'm
80
sorry. Yeah, I thought you were
aircraft.
talking about the average.
So it's 80 in the fit.
Yes, yes.
All right,
yes.
and then for Ms. Gleason, the B-21, what's the $3 billion going to buy? What's it going to pay for?
It's continuing. So that program has been pretty much on schedule for the life of the program. It's moving into manufacturing design. Let me see if I have any more
They
specifics.
say so little of it, but so this is a good opportunity.
Yeah, and
for
a
you to-
lot of that's just
Yeah.
because it is fairly sensitive, as you are well aware. 'Cause
Yeah.
I think you and I have talked about this 3 years in a row, Tony.
Yeah, too
Let's
sensitive.
see here what we've got. So the most I have is it's proceeding on schedule and building on 3 years of successful development. I know they're getting ready to move into manufacturing design. So
fair
sorry
enough.
about that.
Rachel? Hi, Rachel Cohen with Air Force Magazine. In the fiscal 19 NDAA, Congress directed you guys to look at ways to accelerate nuclear modernization programs. So I'm wondering if this budget reflects, any shifts in money to do that, the options that you looked at for that.
I don't know that I would say it's any new acceleration. There's a continued commitment in the modernization of the two legs of the triad the Air Force has. Clearly, we're continuing to invest in those two, and it's a significant amount of money every year. But I don't know that I've seen any change in our strategy there.
We've got a last question for Steve Lozy.
The 74 added squadrons was a big priority for Secretary Wilson and General Goldfein. Why is there no funding for any new squadrons in the budget? And is this a sign that Air Force We Need initiative might be dead?
Not at all. This is a sign that the FY20 budget was built at the same time that study was being made. This is a 312 squadron budget. The FY20 request is. That discussion will happen in subsequent years. We owed that answer to Congress based on their direction. It is clearly, as you said, a priority for our secretary, but the FY20 budget was built off the 312 number.
Do you expect next year we'll see added squadrons?
I won't try to predict what will happen, but that's a discussion that will happen going forward.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, we have to drop NDA. Ann and our team in the back are standing by to take any additional questions that you have.